Tonight, every last Friday of the month, we have the so-called Schools Out event. This is the 53rd one since 2018, and we're very proud to have Owen Hatherley. Owen, I've known of Owen near, I think, 15 years, maybe even a bit longer. Owen is a writer. And he writes about cities, he writes about architecture, he writes about music, he writes about politics, about literature, but a very strong stream through his 17 books is architecture. I think architecture always plays a central role in it. Sometimes it is architecture of the past, sometimes it is architecture of the present, sometimes it is architecture of futures past, etc. But the first thing I read of Owen was, well, maybe around the time that you wrote your first book, but Owen had a blog called Sit Down Man, You're a Bloody Tragedy. That was the name of the blog, and I always loved the name of that blog. I think it also had another name, like Life is Nasty, Brutalist, and Short.
That was the URL.
Oh, that was the URL. I see. But anyway, Sit Down Man, You're a Bloody Tragedy. That's the name of the blog. I had to look it up today, where it came from. It was actually a Scottish socialist politician who, while the Prime Minister was giving a very long-winded speech, going on and on and on and being very vague, this socialist Scottish MP stood up and shouted, "Sit down, man, you're a bloody tragedy." So I'm not sure if that means that we are invited to shout that to Owen today. I'm sure he will not give us cause. So his first book after this wonderful blog, I think most of it is still online, I guess, he wrote Militant Modernism, which is a book about, one of the best quotes about it was that it dragged utopianism from the ruins of modern architecture, something like that. It's a wonderful book about the utopian soul of modernist and also brutalist architecture. The book after that, I'm not going to go through all 17 of them, don't worry. You will do that, yeah. But one that really, really got me it was called The New Ruins of Britain, right? The New Ruins of Great Britain. And this was a book about actually the architectural production of that time, of exactly that time. And so this was not old architecture looking bleak in the way that we would recognize as bleakness, like old and gray. And it was architecture that looked brand new. But Owen managed to project a kind of political critique on that architecture that made it seem incredibly bleak. Even it was colorful and shiny, and you just saw, I thought it was brilliant, you saw the kind of emptiness of the soul that lay behind the project of Blair's Britain. So go 17 years or 20 years, 15 years forward, now we're here. Owen's last book last two books. One is about finding a kind of utopian socialist even, or crypto-socialist content in American cities, like the projects. It's a wonderful book. You can get it. It's lying on the bar. And another book is called The Alienation Effect, and it is also a brilliant book. It's about how the idea of English, it's a wonderfully perverse idea, it's how the idea of Englishness was actually informed by Central European refugees who came to England in the first third of the of the 20th century. So these are the kinds of things that Owen writes about, and well, I could go on and on, but then he's here himself. So please, thank you, Owen Hatherley. Oh yeah.
Thank you. So when Wouter was kind of was writing and being like, here's what you could do in the talk to the school, it was kind of like, well, talk about your practice, talk about the things that you do, which is a fatal thing to do for any writer, of just like, talk about yourself. So that's what I'm going to do, because I've been given permission to do it. And I was kind of like trying to work out ways in to do it that wouldn't be either too boring or too self-obsessed. Not that there won't be elements of both in this. And I thought the best way to do it was to do it via going around my flat and going through books and photographing them and describing them and the influence they had on me and how that informed the particular way I write about places and buildings and other things. So there's going to be there's going to be a few of these if they don't disappear. Thank you. And I wanted to start. I was going to start with Brecht, but you've already had a good look at the Brecht, so I'll leave that there. Brecht has always been, I think, just always sort of endlessly go back to Brecht. I think nearly half of the books I've got have sort of Brecht epigraphs, and I just go back to him time and time again. Which is an odd thing, because Brecht is not someone who liked modern architecture at all. He wrote about it once in a short story called The Modern Bauhaus Dwelling, or North Sea Shrimps, which is basically about some sort of war veterans get together and get drunk, and one of them's made some money and got a nice new Bauhaus apartment, and they smash it up in a rage, and then look around it and like, isn't that much better? I love modern architecture. I'm a fully paid up sort of enthusiast for it, really. Sometimes the enthusiasm gets the better of criticality for me, in fact. But everything else about Brecht, the kind of the way of sort of it's sort of based on this sort of wager, which I suppose maybe isn't even true, that you can somehow communicate socialist ideas not through kind of, I am making a film or record about a socialist thing. And the kind of way I would always sort of associate with a lot of British socialist figures, like the singer-songwriter Billy Bragg and the filmmaker Ken Loach, where you kind of do it in this very straightforward meat and potatoes. Here is your meat and potato of socialism, and you eat it and it gives you socialism. I was always kind of much more like the idea of Brecht that they would make you think in a new way. And that there'd be this kind of process of defamiliarization where you kind of undergo, and you would see the world kind of anew and see the world fresh, and that would kind of. And the other thing with Brecht was the commitment to dialectics, which I at least try to be as committed as possible to the dialectic. And the other thing I think I like is the idea, which you would often talk about, of plumpes denken. And you will all know German much better than me, I imagine. But the idea of sort of, a kind of way of doing philosophy in such a way that Brecht often talks about, wanting people to be able to kind of sit and eat his plays. This kind of idea that you would kind of have this kind of particular kind of attention where the philosophy, there'll be a lot of philosophy in there. Brecht had, read more about Hegel, knew his Marx very well, but that it would be expressed in a way that was kind of sharp and sort of brutish and straightforward. Not in a kind of Bruce Springsteen way, but in a kind of very immediate way. And this is my collection of Brecht books, all in English, because I'm, like many English people, appalling. Oh, sorry, it was before that. And as a sort of full Brecht shrine, obviously, it has like a little postcard of him and everything. How do I go forward and back with this? Oh, there's a clicker. I didn't spot the clicker. Oh, hang on. Just the space bar. Okay, great. Thank you. So we've skipped two now, and the other one that we skipped was 2 CDs, which I bought in the 1990s. And I suppose a lot of, I don't want to sort of over-egg this because, you know, I didn't exactly grow up in the Bronx or something, but I did grow up, and I think it's fair to say not a lot of architectural critics from working class backgrounds. And that has had a certain influence on the way architecture was written about. And I am from one, not a particularly typical one. I don't think I can speak for it, but it does give you certain kind of perspectives on the way people talk about architecture. But I think the other thing is that your way into culture in that situation is often quite different to the way into culture if you've sort of raised, with people who already know about everything. So you find out about things via very, very circuitous routes. So I first found out who Le Corbusier was from a quote in a CD single by the, in many ways rubbish but also brilliant band, the Manic Street Preachers, who I kind of love and hate, and I don't think it's possible to kind of, love them wholly because they're so embarrassing but also wonderful. And being a Manic Street Preachers fan was kind of this experience of every kind of record would be a sort of reading list. There'd be this whole kind of comprehensive thing you'd have to kind of train yourself in and read all the references and read all the books. And that's how I think in many ways a sort of generation of people my age kind of came to a lot of sort of radical culture. It's not through, it sort of being a thing they learned at university, although lots of them would go to university. Lots of them would go to university because they'd been Manic Street Preachers fans. And the other one was Intro by Pulp. And of the many books I've written, most are in one way or another about architecture, and the only one entirely about music is about Pulp, because I think they provided a way of looking at space and architecture, for me, at any rate. And they had also this kind of very defamiliarizing way of looking at the city, particularly the city where they were from, Sheffield, in the north of England. I am, as some of you will be able to ascertain, I'm from the south of England. But the particular way that this kind of very, very mundane industrial city was written about as this quite kind of utopian, fascinating space of all sorts of strange things going on behind the net curtains. This, it had this kind of effect. Now, a lot of the music of the 1990s, although it's all kind of getting revived now, a lot of the kind of rock music at any rate, it wasn't really very good, was it? Or at least a lot of it was very, very derivative in a way that you would sort of, it would be this sort of experience in the late 1990s when you would kind of go back and you would kind of listen to all of the things that the bands you liked were ripping off. And you would find the original version, and it would often be quite embarrassing. But it was very much a time when I think there was the end of a period of extremely high quality music writing was still happening. There's two writers that particularly kind of stick in my mind, Simon Reynolds, who was at Melody Maker and also at the same newspaper, so sort of weekly music newspapers that were around at the time. The other one is Neil Kulkarni, who died last year. And they wrote about this music, sometimes quite bad music, as if it was as important as any high literature, as any kind of art house film. They would write about kind of pop music and hip hop, and in the Kulkarni's case, like metal music that I've never liked, as if it, with a kind of theoretical apparatus and a political seriousness that's usually lent to much more conventional art forms. So I spent a lot, these are kind of 4 books about music and the kind of theory of pop music, the aesthetics of pop music, which I wanted to kind of very big influences in the way I would write, I suppose. All for quite different reasons. So I'll start with the worst because get the kind of the bad out of the way first, which is Julie Burchill's anthology Love It or Shove It. Now the James Maxton line, "Sit down, man, you're a bloody tragedy," that actually comes from the epigraph of a book which Julie Burchill wrote with the even worse punk journalist Tony Parsons, thank you, called "The Boy Looked at Johnny." And it begins with this kind of, epigraph about punk rock, and, the book was subtitled something like "The Obituary of Rock and Roll." And the thing with Burchill, and this kind of goes back to a lot of my kind of influences come from, I suppose, what people would call the long 90s. So a moment of sort of political quietism, of a relative economic boom, of very little seeming to kind of happen culturally. And a lot of things were very taboo to talk about, one of them being class, because we were all apparently, as the Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, said, we were all middle class now. So Birchall was a really interesting person to read at the time, even though she was clearly a sociopath, because of the fact that she would insist again and again and again on class and the importance of class. And her music writing and her cultural writing from the early 80s is still quite exciting, and it had an enormous influence on what I did, partly of how vindictive it was. But she ended up a sort of mad transphobe and Zionist, and she's still around, and I don't recommend reading her, but she had her moment, and you know, I would be a liar if I said she wasn't one of my major influences as a writer. Also, much more acceptable people, John Savage, and his book Lincoln's Dreaming about punk rock, and particularly influential of Savage was the way he wrote about two things, one of which was the sort of influence of post-68, or kind of 68 associated sort of philosophy and theory, particularly the Situationist International, and the kind of geography of London and the history of London and their influence on music. I read that book very soon after I moved to London, and so it was almost a sort of served as a sort of guide in a way. And it presented the recent past, so the late 1970s, the sort of moment just before neoliberalism happened. This is this kind of apocalyptic moment where something dreadful was going to happen, and in the end it did. Also, there is Simon Reynolds, who was still very much around and is still very much around, writing very well about music. And this is a book co-written with Joy Press about the enormous misogyny, really, of lots of rock and roll. And I think the thing that I got from that, in a way, was how, if you're interested in culture, a thing that you will happen to you quite a lot is you will find yourself really enjoying things that come from everything you hate. And I think that became very useful in appraising architecture. So the other one at the top is Kojo Eshin's More Brilliant Than the Sun, which is often sort of described as a book about Afrofuturism in music, but in a way that's sort of reductive. There's so much going on in that book that that's only part of it. One of the things that's great about the book is it sort of tries to kind of be written in as experimental and as kind of over the top and exciting a way as the music it writes about. It tries to kind of, you know, it's sort of moments of it are sort of weird sort of 90s cyber poetry. And it has this wonderful phrase that I always go back to about culture as a future shock absorber, which seemed to describe the long 90s very well. That technological change continued, but culture at a certain point became, particularly after kind of early 90s, became much, much less able to register those changes and comment on them. Now, I don't think that's true anymore, but in the culture of the 2000s, I think there were a lot of future shock absorbers on. The other kind of, and I think lots of these are a particular kind of man choice, I'm afraid. And you know, I'm sure there's like an internet meme about this kind of person that read J.G. Ballard when they were 17 and you know everything. And I was one of those people. And I think with Ballard, there's loads of things that I sort of love about Ballard, but one of them is he's very much a writer that everything he does is predicated on sort of taking that future shock absorber off, but writing about a lot of very, very mundane things. So writing about high-rise housing, writing about motorways and cars and Crash and Concrete Island, probably his two best books, and writing about suburbia, business parks, retail parks, writing about these very, very airports, these very, very ordinary spaces of modern life, and trying to kind of take this kind of screen off them that's been kind of overlain across them so you don't see how strange and novel and weird and disturbing they actually are. So very, very pro Ballard. Now this is sort of a sort of ragbag. Some of these are sort of things that I would have loved at the time and ended up quite rejecting, and that is, but I think one should be kind of credit sort of influences that you've sort of, they've been important for you and then you've come to kind of, it'd be arrogant to grow out of them, but here we are. And those would be the Situationist International, as previously mentioned, and Ian Sinclair, the English kind of poet and novelist and travel writer. Both of them, the kind of concept of psychogeography kind of revolved around them, as it was sort of understood in the 2000s. The actual term is coined by the situationists, by Ivan Shishklov in his Formulary for a New Urbanism, which is a wonderful essay. And I think that kind of early situationist period where they're very attached to architecture and art, their most Dutch phase, I think, in terms of their personnel. That moment, on the one hand, sort of very, very exciting, but I ended up sort of going in a more bureaucratic direction of the things that interested me. And similarly with Sinclair, there was a kind of thing of like, I loved the way that he would take place and write about it. And again, like that thing with Ballard, that these things that were very, very mundane that you would walk past all the time, he would write about them in such a way that you could no longer just walk past them. And that was good and important, but he, I think, had an enormous blind spot for anything after about 1960. Wouldn't see the complexities in things that were built after a certain point, but could see the complexities in anything that happened in the 19th century, which became a bit tiresome, I think. But some of his writings are wonderful. One of them here, the novel Downriver, I still think is one of the great novels of the 1990s in the English language. So, you know, when he dies, I'll say that. The next lot. So again, a sort of ragbag here. Mike Davis, enormously important. I think when Mike Davis and Frederick Jameson sort of died within a year of each other, you could sort of tell a lot about people by who they were most obituarizing, I suppose. And I've always found Jameson a fascinating figure, and I have no particular beef for Jameson, but it never had the sort of emotional connection that I would have from reading Mike Davis. So Mike Davis, for those of you that don't know, which I imagine is few, Californian Marxist, urbanist, historian, geographer, catastrophist of one sort or another. And I think the first book, not counting England's Dreaming, that I ever read about a city was City of Quartz by Mike Davis, which I read. It's a big book, and I read it, started reading it at about 8 p.m. and read it until 4 in the morning without sleeping. I couldn't stop. I was absolutely just riveted by the thing. And one of the subtitle of it is Excavating the Future in Los Angeles. And this particular idea that he has in this book, that lots of the kind of malevolent things that you can find in the kind of, at the time he's writing, the kind of late 1980s, but really kind of everywhere, of sort of suburbanization, mass incarceration, the destruction of public transport, the destruction of the left, the destruction of public housing, that these things were all happening in LA decades before they were happening anywhere else. And you could trace their histories through LA. And that became, I've never been to LA to this point, to this day. But probably my favorite book about the city is about a city I haven't visited. It's possible that if I visited, I might like it less. Also here are sort of three writers who I think are very, very useful in ways that are not as immediately apparent, but they all kind of feed in one way or another. One of them is Jonathan Raban, who's a travel writer who wrote a fantastic book in 1974 called Soft City. One of those books that I go back to time and time again. Every couple of years I reread Soft City. And again, it has a lot of judgments on modern architecture and the welfare state that I wouldn't necessarily share. Enormously critical of them in the way that I think you could only be in 1974 if you didn't realize what things would be like without them. But it's a wonderful kind of atmospheric book about cities. It's sort of a particular sort of 70s London of sort of Formica cafes and already dilapidated high-rise housing and, kind of patchouli oil and incense type boutiques where they're playing, Tapestry by Carole King. That is the kind of world it takes place in. But it begins, although most of it is about London, it begins with Southampton. And Southampton is where I'm from. So readings, it was the first time I'd read anyone write about this city. And the reason why I later found out from him, the reason why he had written about it was his father was a vicar there. So although his family were Londoners, he ended up for a time living in this high-rise, newly built high-rise district on the edge of Southampton, because his father was, in the Church of England, ministering the gospel to the people of the Millbrook estate. Now, the Millbrook estate was the last of the big public housing estates in my hometown to be built, and the city had a policy of housing its architects on the estates that they'd built. And Millbrook was where the architects were like, it was the exact moment when they were like, this policy ends here. So the architects refused to be housed on Millbrook. And my stepfather is from there, so it's not as bad as all that. But it's points and slabs with green space on the edge of a forest. It's bleak and remote. Next to that is Angela Carter, and Angela Carter was interesting for me for writing about where I moved to, which is southeast London. The book Wise Children is about Brixton, and about kind of Brixton pre-Windrush and partly post-Windrush, but it again, it's a thing that sort of writes about southeast London in a way that and that particular sort of inner suburban London, so not the kind of wealthy parts, not the kind of comfortable parts, but this kind of the bit in between that would later be where gentrification would happen, but that hadn't really occurred when she was writing. Also, her non-fiction was always fascinating for how she wrote about cities and buildings. There's a wonderful essay on Castle Market that's since demolished, brutalist megastructure with various markets, 4 levels of markets in it. There's a wonderful one on the Art Deco Tooting Granada Cinema, which was designed by one of the designers of the Moscow Arts Theatre. So this kind of sense that, that starting to kind of realize that the place where you lived, even if it was quite uninteresting, would be full of these places that you could kind of explore. And again, the film would be taken off it a bit, and you could realize that what you were looking at wasn't some sort of generic backdrop, but it was, they had histories, and they had, their enthusiasts, and some of them kind of upended a lot of the sort of quite tedious time that you were in. Above that is James Baldwin, and Baldwin, I'm very glad by the sort of Baldwin revival of the last 10 years, because there was a time in which he wasn't particularly hip. And Baldwin, sort of great, I think, for sort of writing about politics with enormous nuance that does not nonetheless complicate the fact that he takes a very, very strong line. And I think that's a very, very difficult thing to do, and it's a thing I always try to do, and I probably sometimes fail, probably often fail. But being able to write about the kind of complexities of a situation and still come out and go, well, this is what I think and this is where I stand. And generally people skip that first bit. Or they just stay with that first bit and then go, well, who can tell who's in the right? And which I obviously think is cowardice. So that's going to be superseded with the next one, which is about when I tried to be an academic. I think I sort of came to sort of realize that one of the kind of periods in which all of the things that I was interested in kind of came from, that kind of crucible, was the 1920s, and particularly the 1920s in the Soviet Union and in Germany. And also to an extent, the Netherlands, also to an extent Czechoslovakia. But that kind of, the constructivist moment, let's say. And I read a book, which I found in the then quite newly opened Tate Modern, by someone called Esther Leslie, called Hollywood Flatlands, which you can see there in the middle. And it was one of those real sort of, scales from the eyes, like this upends and transforms everything kind of book. So to describe it in one sentence, is basically a book about how the historical Marxist avant-garde fucking loved Walt Disney and why that was. So Eisenstein, Walter Benjamin, the Soviet constructivists, Siegfried Kracauer, all Charlie Chaplin, all of these people that were strongly on the left. Even for a little while Adorno, although being Adorno, he would change his mind quite quick and say that it was all fascism. But they all kind of adored Walt Disney. And so there's kind of, again, this thing about like, what if the thing that you hate is actually the thing that you most love? Kind of comes up again. So I looked her up on the internet, which was I was then on, found out that she gave regular kind of readings at a pub in Camden and said, I want to do a PhD, will you supervise it? And she just looked at me like, who the fuck are you? Yes, all right then. So she did, and I did it, I finished it, I got my PhD, and it was about, it was really kind of a footnote to her book, really. It was about Americanism, and particularly the Soviet avant-garde and its connection with slapstick comedy, and it wasn't as good as what she did, and there are various reasons why I didn't kind of pursue academia after that. But if I were to have done, that's how I would have done it. And there's various of her books here, and they all have a similar kind of approach. They often kind of take a particular form or a particular technology and kind of trace the political aesthetics of it. So there's one about the German chemical industry, which is astonishing. There's one about liquid crystals, as in the displays that you have on your phone and your laptop. There's one about Imperial Chemical Industries, the British conglomerate that make all sorts of dubious and exciting things. But she's sort of best known, rather unfortunately, for writing various books, all of which are good, about Walter Benjamin, but her own work, for some reason, I think because it falls between so many stools, it's kind of philosophy and history of science, it's sort of Marxist aesthetics, it's history of technology. There's a whole load of things going on there that people are just kind of like, there's too much here, please tell us some more about Walter Benjamin, which I think is a great shame. I think she deserves to be famous. And when I was writing this, the two writers that ended up sort of becoming, you know, for a long time to come, the sort of major touchstones for me were Benjamin, obviously, and Victor Shklovsky. And Benjamin, particularly the arcades, actually. I think the arcades has a sort of unwarranted reputation for being deeply sort of forbidding and fragmentary and unreadable, like it's some sort of Finnegan's Wake of Marxist aesthetics, and it's just, again, it's the thing that I just endlessly go back to, find it endlessly productive to read. So a sort of, you know, again, a sort of excavating the future book, but this time in Paris in the 19th century, and this particular idea that you could use this particular form, in this case, obviously, the arcades of early and mid-19th century Paris, and you could excavate an entire political history. You could connect it to the revolution, you could connect it to the changes in science, you could connect it to the changes in relations between the sexes. There's a whole load of things that all kind of spring from this. And you could tell that history through fragments. It's very much a book that I don't regard, I've never really regarded as a failure. I've always regarded it as fascinating, just as this kind of montage experiment where you're given this kind of series of files that each kind of follow a particular theme, and then, you know, the quotations and his own contributions sort of montaged within that. You know, like a sort of Vertov or Eisenstein film. Next to that is Shklovsky, and unlike with German, where I never made an attempt to learn it, I did make an attempt to learn Russian, and it didn't go very far, and I'm probably still mispronouncing Ostranyeny, but that's the word. So it's usually translated as defamiliarization, and I think it's a term which Shklovsky kind of introduces into the world, and sort of via Sergei Tretiakov, it becomes Brecht-Verfremdung effect. But originally, actually, with Shklovsky, he tries to make it quite apolitical. For him, it's strictly an aesthetic experiment, at least at the start. I think later, Shklovsky's work gets more politicized. But originally, it's solely a way of explaining how art works. And he uses a particular passage in Tolstoy where a character, as I remember, after a bereavement, kind of looks around their house and suddenly sees everything in it, which previously they hadn't, and some sort of traumatic event has enabled the objects within it to be estranged and defamiliarized, and suddenly you can see it, and you can see how this connects with everything else. The other thing with Shklovsky is his memoir. Well, I mean, lots of his books are memoirs of one sort or another, and I always loved the way he writes about himself and kind of draws theoretical and political and aesthetic arguments out of his own often quite trivial experiences. But the last of his big memoirs, Mayakovsky and His Circle, which was written in 1940. So at a point at which writing about the avant-garde wasn't particularly easy to do, he had to self-censor and not mention anyone that had been killed by Stalin, which included quite a lot of important people in the story. But of the people he was allowed to talk about, he writes about them beautifully, and it's kind of, there's an entire world within this book of these kind of socialist modernist aesthetes in Moscow in the 1920s and what they're up to and what they're trying to do and why. And it's very, very moving and very, very kind of light-hearted, rather bizarrely given the time and place it was written. So how does this all connect to architecture? I think one of the crucial things of this, and that's always been a very, very important thing, I think, in British intellectual life in general, is the very extensive culture we have of sort of serious mass market publishing, which the US never really has had in the same way, for instance. It's quite possible lots of the rest of Europe has, but certainly of English-speaking countries, it's very much specifically a British and specifically a post-war thing. And it owed almost entirely to Penguin Books. And one of its major editors was a Leipzig-raised, Dresden-trained historian of art called Nikolaus Pevsner, and he somehow convinces the founder, Alan Lane, to pay for him to write a series in which he describes the buildings of every county in the United Kingdom. He does England himself mostly. Other people are given Scotland and Wales to do. Later, buildings of Ireland is done. But he does everywhere in England, and he spends like 20, 30 years doing it. And they've sort of regularly been updated. I often kind of prefer his because they have his extremely German judgments on a lot of British life. And again, he has this wonderful sort of estranged but fascinated relationship to Britain, which I really like. A lot of the kind of bullshit that's kind of put onto Britain by, let's say, a kind of topographical writer like John Betjeman, he strips off. He tells you, and again, later a writer like Ian Sinclair will put onto it all of these kind of layers of sort of myth and pathetic fallacy and melodrama are kind of taken off, and it's just like, this building was designed by this person, they were in this movement, which I explain in the appendix. I think it's quite good. It was built in this year, made out of these materials. And then move on to the next one. And in the 60s, in the kind of later volumes, he starts to have a lot more kind of, a lot saltier judgments and becomes a bit more kind of relaxed about it. But that specific thing of kind of taking all of this kind of bollocks, for want of a better word, off the kind of way buildings were described was enormously liberating, I think. And again, if you're not interested in that bollocks, he makes architecture incredibly accessible to you. It's just, it's like, here's the information, go and take it. And I think there's a particular form of kind of post-war welfare state culture, and I probably can be prone to romanticizing it, and there are various things about it that are problematic, as they say nowadays. But I think one of the things that I like about it as an educational project, and I think that it kind of is quite different to how the kind of 68ers saw education, is that what someone like Pevsner does is he accumulates a load of information and he gives it to you in this really straightforward way. I found all these things out, here they are. Here are the tools, basically. And I think later on, that becomes a lot more unfashionable, but if you're trying to teach yourself about a subject that you know nothing about, in this case architecture, which is what I was trying to do, I think because of all of the kind of threads that I've been trying to sketch out up to this point, there was no one better to do it. But the books that become most influential and most important are often the ones that aren't the ones that are sort of famous or even good. And for me, one of the ones that was really head-spinning, the first kind of architecture book that I read, Pevsner, it would be like, at the time I was probably mainly looking actually, in a lot of cases, for classical buildings. He would tell you about Hawksmoor and Wren and so forth. But for modernism, this book from 1967, I think, was completely kind of bonkers. So New Directions was a series by an American publisher. A few kind of famous-ish people, like Robert Stern did volumes. He did the American volume. Fantastic Japanese volume by the Australian architect Robin Boyd. But this one, I don't know anything about Royston Landau. I've never found anything about him. I don't know who he is. But I go back to this book all the time. So it's written at the real height of sort of British modernism. at its kind of peak of sort of utopian hubris, really. So a lot of it is about sort of municipal planning and ordinary planning, but also a lot of it is about Archigram and Cedric Price and the kind of, the stuff that wouldn't get built, basically. And there's all sorts of, and I think one of the things that it did, and Pevsner also did this, is made you realize that a load of things you weren't supposed to like were good. A load of things that were kind of conventionally demonized had ideas behind them. They were done deliberately. So Southampton is a city that got very, very bombed, not quite as bombed as Rotterdam, but pretty bombed, in 1940, and rebuilt in a very, very high modernist style. So I'd sort of grown up with this stuff, lived in this stuff. It was kind of, it was my environment growing up. And I think I always did like it, but I always felt like I couldn't say I liked it. And it was really interesting to kind of read these books from the 60s when the stuff's actually happening and find out what's the rationale behind this. Before J.G. Ballard says that you'll end up eating your dog, before all of those Suede songs about doing skag in the Aylesbury estate or whatever, there's a kind of moment where this stuff is actually, part of a sort of progressive social democratic project, and it has reason behind it. But the two kind of projects where I was like, oh my God. So one of them is the replanning that never happened of Southampton itself as a sort of Tokyo Bay style megacity, which I ended up doing a radio program on earlier this year, which is sort of, it was a thing I'd wanted to do for many, many years, to do something about this. But the one below that, I think also sort of equally fascinating, was Park Hill in Sheffield. And Park Hill, if you're a fan, which one or two of you might be, of pulp, is significant for its appearance in the song Sheffield Sex City. At the end of the song, everyone came in unison. Everyone in Park Hill came in unison, and the whole block fell down. And again, the sort of utopian post-modernist experience. It's all kind of in that line. I didn't know where Park Hill was. I knew it was in Sheffield, obviously, but I didn't know anything about it. And to find out in this book that actually Park Hill was this part of this kind of utopian streets in the sky, community in the air kind of experiment, was really kind of like, so that's why, someone's kind of, Jarvis Cocker has spotted this and put it into a song, and, it's not accidental. The other architecture book, sort of alongside these, was Ian Nairn's London. This is one of my 3 copies of Nairn's London. This is the first copy I bought, and you can see why I had to get several other copies. So Nairn's London, it's 1966 Guide to the Architecture of London, essentially. Very, very personal, quite eccentric, kind of suggestive of extensive alcohol abuse in places. But it's really it's the Ulysses of London architecture. Like it's an incredible kind of modernist, elliptical, eccentric text, beautifully written. And the thing about Nairn that I really, really like is that he writes of equal enthusiasm about classical and modern architecture. There's no sense with him that you have to come down on a particular side, which, I mean, I do come down on a particular side, but when it comes to, I spend much more of my time than I write about looking at pre-modernist architecture and really enjoying it. I think hopefully the cross and the tick that I photoshopped on these should speak for itself. And it kind of, instead of trying to sort of teach oneself urbanism, because I'm not going to sort of make myself out to be some sort of huge autodidact here. I was working on a PhD, but I wasn't working on a PhD about urbanism or architecture. Trying to teach yourself urbanism, you'll always end up with this in one way or another. And in many ways, it's an admirable book. The thing I like about it is Jacobs' insistence on considering that her perceptions are important, that what you can see happening with your eyes when walking around is important, and that you can get insights and ideas and kind of models of planning from walking around on your own 2 feet and looking and using your eyes. Not as many as I think she makes out, but you can get insights from it. I think she then kind of, goes from there to this very, very, very American kind of planning philosophy in which race and class are of no importance whatsoever, but what's of huge importance is how long your street block is. And, it's pseudoscience, a lot of it. But in many ways, everyone kind of goes through a Jane phase. And I certainly did. And I think my Jane phase of it sort of decisively ended was in reading Ruth Glass and realizing that there was someone doing this work in the 1960s who was doing it far, far better, who was completely forgotten, but for the fact that they coined a term. So Ruth Glass is probably one of the most cited people in urban studies, and also is completely out of print. And the term that she coins is obviously gentrification in the 1964 essay London Aspects of Change. Ruth Glass was German. She was from the sort of German Marxist aesthete milieu in the Weimar Republic. Knew all the people, knew Brecht, knew George Grosz and so on. Was a young sociologist and activist. Escaped Nazi Germany. She was Jewish, but also a communist, so, obviously had to get out. Later very friendly with the historian Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote a beautiful obituary of her, which you can find online. She doesn't write many books, but all of the ones she writes are excellent. And they have a similar approach in some respects to what Jacobs is doing. There's a lot of what Jacobs would call pavement pounding. She walks around a lot, and she's on the bus a lot. But along with that comes actual attention to the things that Jacobs ignores, such as class, such as race, such as, what property developers are up to, what landlords are up to, all these things that Jacobs kind of bats away and says aren't important. It's all about the built fabric. For Glass, these things are really, really decisive, which is why her work has aged so much better, because these things are decisive. But she's shamefully out of print. But this very late anthology, which she publishes a couple of years before she dies in the early 90s, is among other things a sort of tribute from someone from that kind of German Weimar culture to a lot of post-war Britain and its social planning. I'm just being like, you've been convinced to be ashamed of the thing of which you should be most proud, is one of the lines that she has in that book. And I think that was very much my feeling. So in terms of actual kind of writing, how to come to writing, not sort of writing about, not sort of academic writing, but writing. Blogs were really important, as Wouter has pointed out. And the blog that was most important in all of this was a blog called K-Punk by Mark Fisher, who's now, I think, pretty famous. I'm pretty sure Capitalist Realism is in Dutch. It's in every other language. And I knew him a little bit. We were friends for a few years. I started blogging very much under his influence, and like all influences, you then spend a lot of time trying to write yourself out of the thing that you've been so influenced by. But he was an absolute sort of machine of producing this constant stream of sort of ideas and insight and rage and philosophy, and again at a very, very barren time in the 2000s. The fact that there's recently been this film about him in which he's played by a CGI monkey has very much reminded me that Robbie Williams is probably the person that most exemplifies that time. Just this kind of cultural thing in which nothing is said without a raised eyebrow. Nothing is ever really felt. No original idea is produced. And I think the reason why people are so fascinated with Robbie Williams is because of the kind of gaps in his self-produced image. The fact that he was obviously had terrible mental health problems, but tried to hide that through constant gurning. But I mean, who cares? If your art is rubbish, I don't care if you're mental. I'm sorry. From blogging, a lot of the people that were in a particular blog scene. So it was Mark Fisher, all kind of in and around London mostly. There were people who were elsewhere. Other bits of Britain, so there was one writer, a very fine writer, Alwyn Crawford in Australia, but mostly it was a load of people that lived in South London. And so some of them are now people that I don't often talk about because their politics went quite strange. Some of them are people that I'm still friends with. But they ended up in a publisher called Zero Books, which was the novelist Tarek Goddard met, I think, at a party, someone that was running a Mind, Body, Spirit publisher, and managed to convince him to fund, I know all of these writers, they have blogs, how about they all do books? And somehow this guy agreed to it with the proviso that none of us got any money. And that's what happened. And so the one just before, Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, was the third of those books. The first was mine. It's all kind of ended quite badly with that publisher, as it often happens, but it was a time. So it was like a lot of these books, they were kind of compendiums of blog posts. And this is very much what this book was. Apart from the introduction and some of the conclusion, it was all things that had appeared on blogs that I'd kind of rewritten and kind of minced and shoved together into a, cut and pasted and sellotapes, and then said that was a book. And it was, I think the kind of line that I came up with at the time was sort of defense of modernism against its defenders. And by that I meant a particular way that I think people were reappraising modern architecture at the time. So it was written mostly in 2006 and 7, finished in 2008 and published the year after. So people like kind of Alain de Botton, I suppose, the kind of the philosopher Alain de Botton, but quite a lot of people were sort of doing this kind of after postmodernism, which had become quite unhip. There was a sort of reappraisal of modernism that tried to sort of strip all of the difficult things out. Kind of go, yes, well, we know it eventually ended in bad high-rise concrete panel housing in provincial places like Southampton, but once it was this beautiful idea in Vienna and Berlin and and Paris. And so what I tried to do in the book was insist on the epigons, basically. Was kind of insist on the kind of way that idea percolated down to places like where I was from. And this kind of, I ended up doing a series for the architecture magazine Building Design, which at the time was really good. It was a kind of trade paper, and it was given away for free to architects, but at the time it had this kind of great luck. Sometimes like a kind of, a thing has a sort of editorial kind of group who happen to be quite something. And it was Amanda Bailey and Ellis Woodman, and they had this perfect balance in that Amanda had this very tabloid way of looking at architecture. She wanted scandals and she wanted big stories. I mean, the campaign to save Robin Hood Gardens was one of those scandals. So it wasn't entirely shallow, but some of it was quite kind of Norman Foster ate my hamster. Whereas, and then Ellis would do these kind of articles where he would, I've just seen this housing scheme in Ghent, which is, made entirely out of one brick, and it's incredible. And and I can explain why using Goethe, and that balance of like, the intellectualism of one and the tabloidism of the other, made it a really, really fun place to work. And quite a few kind of architecture writers came out of that moment. Ollie Wainwright being probably the best known. So they let me do this series where I would go around the UK with this kind of, the particular idea being, I suppose, that the long 90s, as people didn't call it at the time, was over. So, that there was a kind of moment between the kind of boom of the mid-90s that ended in 2008 with the financial crisis, where there was a kind of a load of money was spent on architecture and a load of money was spent on rebuilding cities and kind of de-suburbanizing them, densifying them, kind of building housing on their former industrial areas. People whose parents had moved to the suburbs moving back when they became of age. And the funny thing is, the first place I wanted to write about was my hometown, partly because none of this had happened to it. And one of the reasons why none of this had happened to it was that it was an economically successful city. Its port didn't have to be turned into luxury flats because its port was still working and it was in the city centre. So it was just still there. Whereas, so in a way, the kind of 80s had never really ended there. But the place that I've really enjoyed writing about because of how much I hated it, was Manchester. And Manchester, I was thinking about Rotterdam and Manchester on the way up here, because I often feel that Rotterdam is a bit like what would have happened if Manchester had built the ship canal in the centre of Manchester rather than where it actually is 5 miles down the road in Salford. Very, very similar cities with very, very similar approach to development, let's say, and approach to architecture. Rotterdam's got a better public transport and bike lanes, obviously, because it's in the Netherlands, but there's a lot of similarity. Not that I despise Rotterdam, like I despised Manchester. Rotterdam's lovely, but I did fucking despise Manchester. And I think the thing with it, with Manchester, was that this particular kind of, there was a phrase which Justin O'Connor, who had been sort of involved in some of this stuff early on, had, which was that it had a post-rave urban growth coalition. And realizing that this kind of redevelopment of the city into this kind of high-density neoliberal kind of architectural fairground was taking place at the hands of people that had been involved in the post-punk scene, that considered themselves to be situationists, that considered themselves to be radicals, that they ended up being the exact people in many cases, or at least often the kind of, the lower rung people in that scene would become property developers. And so there was this kind of intrinsic link between these things. All of the and again, all of the things that I had loved had ended up creating the thing that I hated, which was, this city dedicated entirely to capital, no social housing, at the time very little in the way of public transport. And the thing with it is that it had that almost kind of Parisian thing, that it had a ring road around it. And within the ring road, all the money and all the investment was being plunged into this kind of high-rise thing. And then outside that ring road, the place was left to rot, which is still pretty much the case in Manchester. So that was fun to do. And there's a book came out of it, and a lot of the, 3 books ended up coming out of it one way or another, and I think they were all sort of attempts to sort of understand Britain, understand what Britain is, and understand why Britain's architecture and its planning are like it is. Because I suppose the kind of the pat way of describing it is that it's just very, very, very mid-Atlantic. It's public transport and its housing and its planning are never as bad as in the USA, but they're never as good as, as they are in Belgium even, let alone the Netherlands. The kind of ideas behind them, I suppose, came out of two films and 2 books, which really kind of contradict each other in really interesting ways. The films are both by Patrick Keeler. And Patrick Keeler was a filmmaker who had a past in the London County Council Architects Department, had a kind of past in sort of London architecture scene in the 70s. Had also been briefly, he firmly asserts, the guitarist, and before they recorded, for the post-punk band The Raincoats, who are an all-girl band. Anyway, he insists that he played guitar in The Raincoats and then was sacked because he could only do 1 riff. And I thought, I've heard The Raincoats, they only had 1 riff. Maybe it wasn't your riff. But anyway, he was in that scene, in the kind of where architecture and kind of post-punk and situationist ideas kind of rub together. And he directs these 2 films in the mid-1990s called London and Robinson in Space. And they're about, the first one is about the problem of London and the second one is about the problem of England. And I'm afraid a lot of my work sort of revolves around these things in a quite parochial way, because as an island people we can get a bit insular and get a bit obsessed with ourselves and why we are like that. A lot of kind of Keeler's ideas in the first film. So the narrator is following someone around who it's explained he previously has had a bickering sexual relationship with, who is obsessed with the kind of failure of urbanism and modernism in Britain, the fact that it never properly happened, the fact that the kind of ideas of sort of British modernist planning didn't come to pass, and that's the thing that obsesses him and hurts him. The character, it's later revealed, is German. It's also claimed by Ellis Woodman that the character is very, very firmly based on Florian Bagel, the German architect who was Keeler's lover in the 70s, which is a good architectural fact. But the first one kind of revolves very much around this kind of Perry Anderson idea that the problem with Britain is that it had an incomplete bourgeois revolution. So it had a 1649, but it didn't have a 1789 or a 1792. It didn't have a moment where it properly permanently abolished its monarchy. It didn't remove its feudal remnants, and because of that, it was always backward, despite its pioneering role, one would have thought, in urbanization and in industry and in capitalism. But culturally, Britain can seem enormously backward. I mean, I didn't know the half of it at the time. It was all going to get much, much worse. And the second film, Robertson in Space, so these are the book versions. He's done books based on each film where screenshots from it are kind of paired with long quotations from it. So the second film, he completely rejects this Perry Anderson thesis, or Tom Nairn and Perry Anderson, the so-called Nairn-Anderson thesis about Britain's backwardness, and instead draws on the Canadian Marxist historian Ellen Meikson's Wood, and particularly her book, The Pristine Culture of Capitalism. Now, I think it also comes up quite a lot in her book, The Origins of Capitalism, which people do read nowadays, which is good because it's very good. And her argument is that all of the things that you find in Britain that are horrible are not because of its backwardness, but because of its forwardness. The reason why public spaces are nicer in the Netherlands is because of the fact that it never entirely erased its kind of burger culture in favor of just one where capital just floats entirely freely. So she kind of decouples capitalism and the bourgeoisie, quite interestingly. The reason why public spaces are nicer in Italy, which was a big kind of 90s and 2000s obsession in Britain, is because of the fact that, France, similarly, aristocratic remnants. In East Asia, these things are better because of the enormous presence of the developmental state. That all of these examples do not pertain in Britain, and also by association in the USA, because of the fact that there is no, apart from really from, I would say, about 1906 to 1979, there are no restraints on capitalism. So what you get when you go to Manchester or you go to Southampton, in their very different ways, is you get an architectural and building culture in which capitalism does what it likes, and that's what it ends up looking like. And I found that much, much more convincing, and that ended up being where I kind of stopped with Britain. I was like, the problem has been solved. Right, let's move on. I've not got as much on this because it's not as much on my mind, but it was probably as big a thing for me, which was writing about Central and Eastern Europe. And again, I could have a kind of easy sort of biographical explanation for this, I suppose, which is that my grandparents were in the Communist Party, my parents were in a Trotskyist organization, and there was always that sense out there that even if you rejected what happened after, and they would all choose a different year, after a certain point it got bad. But there was always a sense that they had made the break, and so in some way, if you wanted to understand what building cities would be like without capitalism, you had to go and kind of reckon with them, or what modern cities would be like without capitalism. Of course, cities before capitalism is a whole other story. So the first kind of way I got into it, I suppose, was via kind of treating things from that time as sacred relics. You will note that the only books here that in plastic wrappers are the two Soviet ones here, because I will simply not let dirt accumulate on them. So these are both kind of Soviet books from the 20s, which I picked up when working on various books about Eastern Europe. And they are, I suppose, a lot of what interests me about it is that a sort of period in which the avant-garde was sort of as interested in new building technologies, mass housing, skyscrapers, as it was interested in slapstick comedy and so forth. So the one here is about Harold Lloyd. It's just called Harold Lloyd. Next to it, problems of living quarters, I think is a literal translation. But anyway, problems of living areas, problems of living districts. And next to it is Richard Pear, the English photographer Richard Pear's book, The Lost Vanguard, which came out in 2007. And I wrote about a lot in my first book. And that really kind of takes a sort of I guess a sort of Ian Sinclair-y sort of psychogeographical version of the history of the Soviet avant-garde in architecture. Sees it as a sort of series of ruins and sort of enormous sort of failed experiments that are kind of crumbling in an interesting way. And I later came very much to think that that wasn't a useful way to look at it, but it's a wonderful book. And where are my notes? Here we are. What I think, again, it was a sort of, trying to be interested in the epigons, trying to be interested in how an idea percolated downwards. So when I came to write about Central and Eastern Europe in 4 books, it was very much trying to kind of follow how those ideas kind of went from beyond sort of Shklovsky and Mayakovsky and their circle and those cats in Moscow doing weird things to the most banal level, the most banal kind of mass housing. And there's still a sense that I don't regard myself as the Soviet Union was terrible in many, many, many ways, and I tried to write about that as straightforwardly as possible. I don't think it was necessarily replaced with something worse. It was a bad thing replaced with another bad thing. Probably a slightly worse thing, but nonetheless. But a lot of its culture still very much has, I think, I've always interpreted it, it has within it this kind of thing, this kind of spark of a different society. I would often kind of go to like provincial art galleries and you'd see these kind of like socialist realist paintings, and they had something in them, even if they were shit, that kind of pointed in all of these incredible different directions and different ways of organizing society. So those are the books that I did about that, and it's kind of a bit of a different story, a different fairy tale, as they say in Poland. So I'm going to kind of end with the 2 most recent ones, and kind of 2 most recent sort of sets of ones, because often one's connected to another, and where they came from and what I was sort of trying to do with them and what I'm sort of trying to do at the moment, because I think there's a lot of sort of modernist nostalgia. I think it's getting kind of supplanted now with people being really interested in the Anthropocene, non-human life, moss, or what have you. And I don't care for that sort of stuff, unfortunately. But I'm glad that the modernist nostalgia era is over, because it just became a kind of sort of neo-Victorianism in a way. It just became a kind of fetishism of, the beautiful things of the great past. I was like, okay, what can I do with this stuff that might be something else other than that? So I ended up writing these 2 books about cities which I thought were getting a bad rap. There was this kind of idea that, and I think you have a version of that here, that, there's a sort of authentic constituency for left-wing politics, which is coal miners in the 1950s. And when left-wing politics ended up being the preserve of people in big cities, this was a problem. I mean, actually, electorally, it can be a problem. But this kind of idea that the fact that, one thing that started happening in the late 2000s and became a major thing in the 2010s, and was not the case when I was growing up in the 90s and 2000s, was that cities became very left-wing. People younger than me became very left-wing, particularly in London, particularly in New York City. And this really, really interested me. And I tried to write both of these books as a way of kind of connecting them with their own socialist history, which is extensive. A lot of the story of the British welfare state is kind of told through the industrial north, told through mining communities, and they are obviously a very big part of the story. But London is also an absolutely crucial part of pretty much every kind of left-wing moment in British history. And it's written out of it entirely, which I wanted to kind of write it back in. And it was a book also very much about, let's say, socialism from above, and why that's not always a bad thing, or rather why socialism from above often works in interesting and productive ways of a socialism from below. And the way that kind of that accumulated for me, the moment where I tried, was very interesting for writing the book was the 1980s, in which the Greater London Council was had a sort of moment of sort of socialist experimentation that was really productive and often kind of overlooked, which is also, among other things, a specific moment in which the British socialist movement in London at any rate became a much more sort of socially progressive, a much more connected to liberation movements than it had been hitherto. The British Labour Party's record on a lot of, on things like imperialism is not great. And in the 80s, it made an enormous effort in London, in the Great London Council, to connect with what was happening in South Africa, to connect with what was happening in Palestine, connect with what was happening in Ireland. It was also at a point in which this was enormously unpopular. It took a very, very strong line on LGBT rights. So it did a lot of stuff that was very, very kind of difficult to do at the time, of which they were completely demonized by the right-wing press. And the interesting thing about that is that the kind of New Labour era took a lot of their sort of social liberalism, the kind of 2000s, long 90s era, took a lot of that social liberalism. Those people have dropped that since, but they very much were committed to that social liberalism in the early 2000s and dropped the entire economic programme, which was based very much around responding to the failure, as they saw it, of sort of big state planning via a socialist planning of cooperatives, of sort of small-scale democratic experiments, of a sort of, but this would be done by the Greater London Council, which, was the biggest local authority in Europe, using the big bureaucratic state for that purpose. So an enormously productive moment, and I was really kind of like, this was an experiment which really needed to be given much more time to see what would have happened with it. The New York book is obviously different insofar as I've not lived in New York. I've lived in London for 26 years, but New York I have spent, I think, a grand total of 3 weeks in at different times. But it's in many ways quite a similar story. And with New York, I think the story I wanted to tell, it kind of revolved around a sort of corrective to Jane Jacobs, I suppose, particularly through housing. And the kind of, if the London book has as its hero the head of the Greater London Council in the 80s, Ken Livingstone, the hero of the New York book is Abraham Kazan, who was a trade union activist in the Textile Workers Union, and set up various housing cooperatives that rebuilt huge swathes of New York City and built enormous kind of modernist housing complexes like Co-op City. And both of these were, I suppose, trying to be usable pasts, I guess. They were trying to kind of intervene in a thing that was happening politically and be useful to them. These weren't. These were kind of things that I thought I would do because I thought they'd be fun. And they're the most recent. And I think I've sort of tried, I've never sort of been a serious historian, and I think maybe as I get older, I'm trying to be one. Maybe that'd be a good retirement plan. But they ended up with sort of going back to Britain, not in a sort of like me going around and pointing at things way, but trying to understand their sort of modern history through particular themes, and one kind of connected to the other. So this one, Modern Buildings of Britain, this was the only book I've ever done that was a commission rather than the thing I wanted to do, and so it was a little bit tiresome to do in places. I'm not particularly glad I had to go to Reading and Basingstoke and Folkestone and Stoke-on-Trent and Merthyr Tydfil. Anyway, but I did it, and one of the things that ended up happening is I tried to write this kind of long introduction to British modern architecture to understand where it came from. And at the time there'd been a certain amount of revisionist writing on the influence of continental emigres that was very much downplaying them and going like two contradictory things, basically. Going on the one hand, actually our own modernists who weren't foreign were equally good. But also, maybe our classicism was just fine. Maybe it was just fine that we didn't have a modern movement until Hitler came to power, basically. Maybe that's all right. Maybe interwar British culture wasn't incredibly parochial and boring and twee. And in the course of researching this, I decided it was parochial, boring and twee. And I decided that the influence of the emigres was actually as decisive, in fact more decisive than historians have suggested. And so the most recent book kind of comes out of that and came out of a sort of attempt to I don't want to call it a Brexit book. In many ways, it was a book I was trying to do because I didn't want to think about what was happening in Britain. I didn't want to think about, it sort of shifts outside of London and the big cities. It shift towards being increasingly kind of parochial and insular. But it ended up being a book about, how sort of ideas kind of float around and percolate, and also a book about cultural appropriation, and a book about, how culture often comes from these sort of very, very complicated sort of fusions of different things coming from different places that don't always come with the best of intentions, but can create interesting and productive things. So it was sort of a book about cosmopolitanism and why it's good. So I like to think that's enough. So I'm going to stop now. Thank you.